There is so much talk about hazardous materials today. The numbers and varieties of hazardous materials used by businesses is staggering. There are so many ways exposure can occur, and there are many different materials that shouldn't come in contact with your body. When we hear the words hazardous materials, we might think of a large industrial factory. Realistically, though, hazardous materials are used by many different types of businesses in all kinds of work environments. However, most businesses using hazardous materials are small business establishments, just like yours. So what are we really talking about when we refer to a material as being hazardous or a hazardous material? A hazardous material is a material that can cause injury or death to a person using it, or could, if not disposed of properly, damage and pollute land, air, or water, causing harm to others. In the past, workers were not always told about the hazardous materials they might come into contact with on the job. In many cases, container labels and warning sheets didn't give enough information about hazardous materials either. Today, there are new laws and regulations to keep you safe and healthy on the job, such as the one issued by the federal government and OSHA, the Occupational Safety Health Administration. It is called the Hazard Communication Regulation, and it applies to every company that uses hazardous materials at any time. The regulation states that as an employee who works with hazardous materials, you have a right to know what hazards you may face on the job. You have a right to be told about the hazardous materials you may be exposed to and how to protect against them. You cannot be fired or discriminated against because you ask for information and training on how to handle the hazardous materials in your workplace. You have the right for your doctor or representative to receive the same information. Your employer has certain responsibilities under the new regulation. Let's look at these responsibilities. Your employer must explain which materials in your work area are hazardous and where those materials are used. Your employer must train you in the ways that you can tell if a hazardous material has been released in the work area. You must also be taught how exposure to a hazardous material can occur and how to prevent exposure. Finally, your employer must explain how to use personal protective equipment while working with hazardous materials and what you should do in an emergency that involves hazardous material. These subjects and more will be covered throughout the remainder of this training session. As an employee who uses hazardous materials, you also have certain responsibilities. You have a responsibility to read container warning labels and material safety data sheets and follow the instructions and warnings they contain. You must also use the proper personal protective equipment when working with hazardous materials. And remember to ask your employer if you have any questions about the materials. Your employer and the government are making a strong effort to protect you from hazardous materials. But it's really up to you, the employee. As we continue through this tape, you'll realize that you are really the only person that can keep yourself safe and protected on the job. You can do this by being informed. Remember, you have certain rights as an employee because you work with hazardous materials. Your employer must provide training that teaches you how to deal with hazardous materials in your workplace. Ask your employer if you have any questions about a hazardous material. As an employee, you have a right to know, but you also have a responsibility to keep yourself informed. As we continue, we will be discussing 5 distinct areas that make up the remainder of this tape. Each of these areas deals with a different aspect of working with hazardous materials. Section 1 deals with hazardous material identification and information. Section 2 deals with exposure, protective equipment, and first aid procedures. Section 3 deals with mixing and storing hazardous materials. Section 4 deals with cleanup of spills and disposal. And finally, Section 5 addresses the issue of fire and explosion when working with hazardous materials. We now know that a hazardous material is a material that could cause injury or death to a person, or could damage and pollute land, air, or water. How can you tell if a material is hazardous or not? The first way is to check the hazardous material inventory roster posted in your workplace. On this poster, your employer has listed all of the hazardous materials you'll be using. If you're still not sure whether a material is hazardous or not, or if the material is not listed on the inventory roster, read the product label. Product labels are now required to list whether a material is hazardous using one of 4 different properties. The product label will indicate if the material is flammable, corrosive, reactive, or toxic. Flammable means any material that will catch fire easily or could explode. Corrosive means the material is so strong it can dissolve metals and can burn skin and eyes. Reactive means the material will become unstable. In other words, it will burn, explode, or give off toxic vapors if it is mixed with air, water, heat, or other materials. If the material is considered toxic, it could cause illness or death after being inhaled or after it comes into contact with your skin. Now that we know how to determine whether or not the material is hazardous, where do we find more information about the material in order to handle it safely? To learn more about the hazardous materials you are handling, read the Product Container Warning Label and the Product Material Safety Data Sheet, or MSDS. A warning label should appear on each container of hazardous material you use. This is the easiest way to find information about a particular material. The label is supplied by the manufacturer, and it is put there for only one reason: to help protect you. You should always read the warning label on any material before using it on the job. Each label is required by law to list the chemical name of the hazardous material, hazard warnings, hazardous ingredients, and the manufacturer's name and address. There are different types of hazard warnings that appear on labels. 3 different words are generally used to represent 3 varying degrees of hazard. The words are caution, warning, and danger. The word caution means this is the least hazardous type of material. A more hazardous material will have the word warning on the label. The word danger on a label means this container holds a very hazardous material. When you see these hazard warnings, remember that caution means the material is least hazardous, and danger means that material is very hazardous. The label will tell you what particular hazard you could be exposed to: flammables, corrosives, reactive, or toxic. In addition, a label may contain information on first aid and what to do in case a fire should occur. If the container doesn't have a label, don't handle that container. Find out what the material is from your employer. Make sure that all containers are labeled properly if they contain a hazardous material. Torn and unreadable labels should be replaced with new labels. The best source of information about a hazardous material is provided on the Material Safety Data Sheet generated by the manufacturer of the material. The Material Safety Data Sheet, or MSDS, gives you the details that don't fit on a container label. The manufacturer of a hazardous material is required by law to supply an MSDS with every hazardous material he sells. The MSDS tells all the information a manufacturer knows about a material. The law also requires your employer to have a Material Safety Data Sheet for every hazardous material used in your workplace. Material safety data sheets must be kept in an area where employees can easily access the information. Let's go through the 9 sections that every MSDS must have. Section 1, Chemical Identification, lists the chemical name and the manufacturer's name, address, and emergency phone number. Section 2 lists the hazardous ingredients. This tells you what is in a chemical. Section 3 contains physical data that describes what the material looks like, smells like, and how fast it evaporates. Section 4, Fire and Explosion data, tells you at what temperature the material will catch fire or explode. It also describes the type of extinguisher and protective equipment to wear if a fire starts. Section 5, Health Hazards, tells you how you might feel if you come into contact with the hazardous materials and what to do in case of emergency. Section 6 covers reactivity data. This tells you if the material reacts with other materials or conditions and how to mix it with other materials. Section 7, Spill or Leak Procedures, tells you what to use to clean up a spill or leak and the protective equipment to use to protect yourself while cleaning up. Section 8, Special Protection, lists the personal protective equipment needed to safely handle the material you are using. Finally, Section 9, Special Precautions, tells you any other special instructions to follow when handling the material. If after reading the MSDS you still have questions, ask your employer. Don't be afraid to ask questions, and keep asking them until you understand. What you learn could save a life, maybe your life. In this section, we have discussed how to identify a hazardous material and where you can find additional information on the material so that it can be properly handled. We identified which materials are hazardous by looking at the hazardous material inventory roster, or by identifying the characteristics of the material. These characteristics included flammable, corrosive, reactive, and toxic. To find out more information about a material, we looked at the container warning label and then turned to the product material safety data sheet to find more specific information. Exposure to a material can happen in different ways, and the effects of exposure can be short-term or long-term. Short-term effects are generally felt immediately after exposure or after only a few hours. Long-term effects are felt months or even years later, and these effects are more subtle. Although short-term effects of exposure may worry you only briefly, the long-term effects caused by many exposures to a hazardous material can cause permanent damage to your health. If you experience headache, dizziness, confusion, or a very sick feeling after working with a material, you are probably feeling the short-term effects of exposure. Exposure to certain hazardous materials may cause lung, kidney, and liver disease, as well as cancers, sterility, and birth defects in unborn children. Nervous system and brain damage may be caused by materials that are inhaled or absorbed through the skin and find their way into your bloodstream. Now let's look at the different ways that exposure can occur and what kind of problems exposure can cause. There are 4 different ways in which exposure can occur. The first way is eye contact. Eye contact with a hazardous material can lead to eye injury or blindness. The second is inhalation, or breathing the substance. Inhalation can cause damage to the lungs, respiratory system, and brain. Skin contact is another way exposure can occur. Skin contact can cause burns, rashes, or an infection can gain entry through a cut. The fourth way exposure can occur is swallowing. Swallowing a hazardous material can cause internal organ damage and death. Now that you understand the ways that exposure can occur, you must learn how to protect yourself from this exposure by using personal protective equipment. Your employer must pay for the cost of protective equipment and train you in its use. There are different types of protective equipment for handling hazardous materials. Lung and respiratory system protection, which includes 2 types of respirators. Eye protection, which includes glasses, goggles, and face shields. And skin and body protection, which includes gloves, safety shoes, protective suits, aprons, and boots. It is also important to use ear protection to prevent hearing loss. Dust, vapors, and fumes in the air can be real hazards. Unfortunately, you can't often see or smell them. These materials are usually referred to as airborne particles. Most airborne particles that result from a hazardous material can damage your lungs if inhaled. Making sure your work area has good ventilation that directs particles away from you is an excellent way of protecting yourself. In a few cases, a respirator may be required to protect yourself properly. There are 2 basic types of respirators. Some purify the air with a filter, while others supply you with air from a tank. Air purifying or filtering respirators are used when enough oxygen is present, but is contaminated with hazardous gases, vapors, or dusts. Usually color-coded replaceable cartridges are used in this type of respirator. When using this type of respirator, be sure to use the right cartridge and replace it when breathing becomes difficult. The second type of respirator is used when there is not enough oxygen present for you to breathe, or when a cartridge-type respirator is not effective. These respirators usually have a face mask with an air line or a portable air bottle, similar to a scuba tank. Make sure you always know how much air you have left when using a separate air supply tank. It is important to use the right kind of respirator for each of the different hazardous materials you come in contact with. Using the wrong respirator could kill you. You should read the product label and MSDS to know what type of respirator to use. If you're still in doubt, ask your employer. And remember, always use a NIOSH-approved respirator. Before you use any type of respirator, make sure you know how to use it. Inspect the respirator for cracks, tears, and holes that could let in contaminants. Check all the connections and fittings. Above all, it is very important to get a good respirator fit. If the respirator doesn't fit properly on your face, contaminants could leak in. If breathing becomes difficult, or if you can smell, taste, or feel a contaminant leaking in, move to a safe area fast. When working with a hazardous material, you can prevent the material from being sprayed or splashed into your eyes by using safety glasses with side shields or a full face shield. If you normally wear glasses on the job, be sure to get a pair of prescription industrial safety glasses. You know that your eyes and lungs need protection from hazardous materials, but what about your skin and the rest of your body? Special gloves and protective suits protect your skin and body. Safety shoes and boots don't only prevent serious foot injuries caused by falling objects, they also protect against hazardous liquids. Protective suits, aprons, and gloves also protect your skin from extreme hot and cold surfaces. Lastly, there is ear protection. If you work around loud noises for a long period of time, permanent damage to your hearing can result. Various types of earplugs and ear muffs have been designed to prevent hearing loss. If you have to shout to communicate with a fellow employee that is standing only 5 feet away, ear protection is necessary. If exposure should occur, you must act quickly. If there is any doubt, call a doctor. Emergency medical numbers should be immediately visible near your telephone. Even before help arrives, there are several things you can do to help a person exhibiting symptoms of exposure. First, check the product label or MSDS for the product in question. Be sure to act quickly, as delay in treatment usually causes the damage to get worse. For eye contact, flush a person's eyes with plenty of water for at least 15 minutes. For chemical burns, remove contaminated clothing. Flush the area with water. Cover the burn with a dressing or with sterile bandages, and don't put any ointments on it. For large heat burns, cover areas with sterile bandages. Keep the victim quiet and warm, and be sure he has plenty of fresh air. Burned arms and legs should be elevated. Treat the victim for shock. If breathing has stopped, administer cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Every workplace should have at least one person trained in CPR. Courses are available at fire stations and hospitals. Sometimes a victim is in shock, evidenced by cool, damp, pale skin, weak pulse, and unsteady breathing. Keep him warm, raise his feet, and put him on his side if unconscious. Keep a first aid kit handy. You can get first aid training from your local Red Cross or hospital. In this section, we discuss the ways in which exposure can occur, the different types of protective equipment that should be used when working with a hazardous material, and the first aid procedures that should be followed when different types of hazardous material exposure occur. As a general rule, when working with hazardous materials, know the material you are handling and understand the different ways exposure to that material can occur. Secondly, read the product material safety data sheet or the container label and make sure that you use the proper personal protective equipment. Lastly, before exposure occurs in your workplace, make sure you learn first aid procedures and know where supplies are kept. You should also know the telephone numbers to call for medical help. In this section, we will discuss what to do when new hazardous materials arrive, how to mix two hazardous materials together properly, and how to properly store hazardous materials after use. It is important that you make sure hazardous materials are stored correctly. Storage information can be found on the product label, on the product material safety data sheet, and also by reviewing local fire codes. The information will tell you what type of container to store the material in, if the container should be vented, and if the container should be kept away from heat, cold, or wet. The information will also tell you if the material should be stored in a special building or closet. Most flammables should be stored in metal closets. It will also tell you which material should not be stored in the same area due to reactive properties. The information will also tell you if a large container should be grounded to prevent static electricity buildup. Before you store a hazardous material, be sure the material is stored in an approved container, that the container is not leaking, and that the container is tightly closed. Also be sure the proper warning label is in place on the container. Before you mix any hazardous materials, you need to be informed about the material you are mixing and properly prepare yourself and the area where you will mix the material. Being informed means knowing what you are mixing. Read the container label and the manufacturer's instructions for mixing. Read the product MSDS and find out what you can and cannot mix with a certain material. Next, prepare yourself and the mixing area. Find out what type of protective equipment you need to wear by reading the product MSDS. Know the acceptable exposure limits to the material. Make sure the mixing area is well ventilated. Be sure there are no cigarettes, flames, or electrical wiring in the area that could cause the material to explode or catch fire. If there is a need to transfer a hazardous material to another container, make sure large containers are properly grounded. Above all, if you're not sure about mixing two materials together, ask your employer. Mixing the wrong materials together can cause chemical reactions that could lead to a fire or explosion. It is very important to store hazardous materials carefully and to take precautions when mixing different materials together. Be informed about the materials you are mixing and prepare yourself and the area before mixing. When storing a hazardous material, make sure you use an approved container and that you store the hazardous material in an area according to the product label or the MSDS. The proper cleanup of spills and the proper disposal of a hazardous material is necessary to protect yourself and your community. In this section, we will be discussing ways of handling different types of spills and the rules that concern the disposal of a hazardous material once it becomes a hazardous waste. In most cases, if an accidental spill occurs, you are the only one that can act quickly enough to prevent a disaster. Most hazardous materials can catch fire easily, and if spilled over a large area, they begin to evaporate quickly. The vapors add to the fire hazard, and they also find their way into your throat and lungs. If there is a spill, small or large, you must know what to do, and you must react quickly. It is important to be prepared to handle the spill before it happens. The product label and the product material safety data sheets are the best places to start. These two sources will tell you what to use to absorb or soak up the material. They will also explain what type of personal protective equipment to wear to prevent exposure during the cleanup period. When a spill occurs, decide if the spill is large or small. Remove anything that might cause the material to ignite, such as flames, cigarettes, or electrical wiring. If the spill is small to medium size and looks like it can be controlled, try to stop the spill immediately. Use the recommended equipment so that you do not become exposed to the material. Use the recommended absorbents and put the used absorbents in an airtight metal container that is closed tightly and emptied daily. Large spills require special attention because they present an increased safety hazard compared to smaller spills. If a large spill should occur, report the spill to your employer immediately. Your employer will then contact trained cleanup personnel. Warn your coworkers and anyone else to leave the area. Then seal off the area by closing all the windows and doors. Retrieve the product material safety data sheet and be ready to give information to cleanup personnel. Before a spill happens, make sure you know what to do. Sooner or later, the hazardous materials you work with will become hazardous wastes that you need to dispose of. There are new laws and regulations with strict rules for disposal of hazardous wastes. The most important new law is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Your employer knows the details of this new law. Basically, the law says that hazardous materials users are responsible for those hazardous materials from the time they become waste until they are properly disposed of. Although you're not responsible for the whole waste disposal process, you do play an important part in preparing the hazardous waste you generate for disposal or recycling. How do you know what to do with a hazardous waste material? First, check the material safety data sheet for each material under disposal. Next, check with your employer to find out what the exact method is in your workplace for disposal of each hazardous waste. And lastly, follow the recommendations that you have been given. There are really only two legal ways to dispose of hazardous waste. Hazardous waste can be recycled. The only legal way to get rid of waste is to have a licensed disposal contractor remove waste to a treatment facility. Under the EPA regulations, it is illegal and there are penalties for throwing hazardous waste into your trash dumpster or dumping the wastes anywhere other than at a licensed facility. Pouring waste into drains such as sinks, toilets, floor drains, or flushing them into sewers is also illegal. Your workplace should have separate containers for each different hazardous waste material, and each container should have a label telling you what is inside. As an employee, you have certain responsibilities when handling hazardous wastes. First, make sure you place waste in the correct storage containers, and make sure containers are tightly sealed and not overfilled. Secondly, make sure you don't mix different hazardous wastes, or hazardous waste you think might react together, in the same container. If you have any doubt, ask your employer. And lastly, make sure you wear the proper personal protective equipment when handling a hazardous waste. Hazardous waste can threaten you and your community. Please do your part to protect yourself and everyone around you from accidents that can happen when a hazardous waste is not handled properly. In this section, we have discussed the proper cleanup of spills and the proper way to dispose of hazardous material once it becomes a hazardous waste. To handle a hazardous material spill, you must know what to do and act quickly. If there is a spill, decide if the spill is large or small and take the appropriate action. Remember to report the accident to your employer. When a hazardous material becomes a hazardous waste, make sure you place wastes in the correct storage containers and that you don't mix different wastes in the same container. Also remember to wear the proper protection when handling hazardous wastes. Fires and explosions are a risk in almost every workplace. Why? Because many businesses use hazardous materials that burn easily and could explode. 3 ingredients are necessary for a fire or explosion to occur. There must be a flammable material in liquid, solid, or vapor form. There must be air to supply oxygen so the flammable material will burn. There must also be an ignition source to get the fire or explosion started, such as matches, a cigarette, or a spark from various sources. You should always determine if a material you are using is flammable. You can find this information by reading the container label or the Fire and Explosion section of the MSDS. The Fire and Explosion Data area of the MSDS talks about the flash point of a material. The flash point of a material is the lowest temperature at which a flammable liquid gives off enough vapor to form an explosive mixture with air. The lower the flash point, the more dangerous the material. You need to understand that if a material is flammable, under certain conditions, that material could explode. Flammable liquids can explode during storage, transfer, and disposal. Poor ventilation can cause explosions when vapors build up in an area that doesn't have fresh air circulating through it. Chemical reactions cause explosions when 2 materials are mixed together that shouldn't be. How can fires and explosions be prevented? First, identify the flammable materials you normally use. Make sure large quantities of these materials are stored away from the regular work area. Remove all ignition sources and activities from areas where flammable materials are used or stored. Inspect your work area and make sure hazardous material residues don't build up. Make sure the work area is well ventilated. Make sure large containers are properly grounded and that spills are cleaned up promptly. It is important to know what to do when a fire or explosion occurs. First, tell your employer there is a fire and have him call the fire department. If you can control the fire, use the proper protective equipment and the proper type of fire extinguisher to put the fire out. The MSDS describes the type of fire extinguisher to use on the material, special care you should take in handling the flammable material, and special firefighting methods. If the fire is uncontrollable, get everyone out and seal off the area. Wait for trained professionals to arrive. Above all, the first thing to do when you discover a fire is to call the fire department. It's better to have a fire truck arrive when the fire is already out than later when the fire is out of control. To prevent a fire or explosion, you need to know what can cause these events. Remember the basic ingredients. A source of ignition, plus air, plus a flammable material can cause a fire or explosion. When a fire or explosion does occur, call the fire department first. If you can control the fire, use the proper protective equipment and the right extinguisher for the job. In this tape, we looked at many different aspects of dealing with hazardous materials in your job. Let's take a few minutes to review the important points presented in this training session. There are many types of hazardous materials which are present in all types of workplaces. You have the right to know exactly what hazards you may face on the job. Your employer must provide training that teaches you how to deal with the hazardous materials in your workplace. You have a responsibility to keep yourself informed. In dealing with hazardous materials, you must be able to identify them and get adequate information about them. To tell if a material is hazardous or not, first, check the hazardous materials inventory roster posted in your workplace and read the product labels. Material safety data sheets stored and easily accessible in your work area provide additional information that doesn't fit on the container label. Exposure to hazardous materials can occur from eye contact, inhalation, skin contact, or swallowing, and the effects of exposure can be short-term or long-term. You can protect yourself from exposure by using the proper personal protective equipment designed to provide lung and respiratory system protection, eye protection, skin and body protection, and ear protection. You must be aware of first aid procedures and be prepared to use them. Know where to find emergency phone numbers. Make sure you keep a first aid kit handy. Consult the material safety data sheet for additional information on the material causing the incident, and make sure you get your employer involved immediately. Make sure all hazardous materials are stored correctly in the proper containers. Before you mix any hazardous materials together, you need to be completely informed about the properties of the materials you are mixing and correctly prepare yourself and the mixing area. The proper cleanup of spills and the proper disposal of a hazardous material is necessary to protect yourself and your community. Being prepared to handle a spill before it happens is most important. If a spill occurs, remove any possible ignition causes from the area immediately. Then, consult the material safety data sheet and the product label for information on what to use to absorb or soak up the material, as well as what protective equipment you should use to prevent exposure. There are strict new laws and regulations for disposal of hazardous wastes. Your employer is familiar with all of these new rules. When you need to dispose of hazardous wastes, first, check the material safety data sheet for each material under the disposal section. Remember, there are only two legal ways to dispose of hazardous wastes: recycling them or having a licensed disposal contractor remove waste to a treatment facility. Check with your employer to find out the exact method of waste disposal for each material at your workplace. Then, follow the recommendations and procedures you've been given. Fires and explosions occur when flammable materials come into contact with an ignition source. To prevent fires and explosions from happening, first, identify the flammable materials you normally use. Make sure large quantities of these materials are stored away from the regular work area. Remove all ignition sources and activities from areas where flammable materials are used or stored. Inspect your work area and make sure hazardous material residues don't build up. Make sure the work area is well ventilated. Make sure large containers are properly grounded and that spills are cleaned up promptly. If a fire or explosion does occur, call the fire department first. If you can control the fire, make sure you use the proper protective equipment and the right extinguishers for the job. Now that you have learned how important it is to understand the hazardous materials you work with, make an effort to develop good safety habits and attitudes. Don't forget, what's at stake is your health.